Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this episode. This time I am speaking with Dr. Marie Christine Duggan, who's been on the show before, and she's just a fascinating person, one of the smartest people I know. And we get into some really interesting discussions about the history of early California, especially when it was part of New Spain. And we talk about questions that I've had on my mind. For example, why the Spanish came up the California coast in 1602 and then didn't come back for another 160 years, 100 and almost 170 years. Why the Spanish, for example, were so fearful of the British that they decided to come and colonize Alta California. And also, we'll talk about the first global war, the first, I guess not world war, but something that we could call the first global war, and how the Russians managed to make their way into California. So that's all in the first half of this interview. I split it up into two, and this episode is the first half of the interview, and you will hear the second half later. So enjoy Dr. Marie Christine Duggan. Marie Christine Duggan, good to see you again and good to talk with you. And you are in Mexico City, is my understanding, right?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Damien, for inviting me onto the podcast, and thank you for what you do. And yes, I am live from Mexico City today, doing work in the archives and meeting some Mexico City commercial historians to give me insights.
So let's see. Why don't you you bring us up to speed a little bit? Well, first of all, if any of our listeners haven't listened to the first couple of conversations we had, they should definitely go back, and I'll link to those and listen to them. But maybe just for a refresher, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then we were going to talk about the research that you're working on and some interesting topics related to Alta California, related to California.
Yes. Well, my name is Marie Christine Duggan, and in the United States, I would say I was raised in Berkeley, California, and I have a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, and I teach business management at Keene State College, which is part of the university system of New Hampshire. I've been there for 22 years, and I have 2 children. Now, if I were introducing myself in Mexico, I found that they want me to say something else.
Mm.
They want me to tell you my lineage. And then I would say, I am Marie Christine Duggan Conyers, Duggan being my father's side and Conyers being my mother's side. And my father was Joe Duggan, who was a French professor and then a comp lit professor at UC Berkeley, and later became the assistant director of graduate admissions. And my mother is Mary Kay Duggan. Well, they would say she's Mary Kay Conyers, right? Because you don't really lose your maiden name. And she is
Conyers de Duggan.
Yeah, that's right. But you don't actually use the day part so much. So I would actually, yeah. So anyway, she's from a German English heritage, and she also she's a retired UC Berkeley professor. She's trying to get her second book published. So I think about that a lot. And I was married. I'm divorced now. I was married to a Peruvian. So we could say Marie Christine Duggan Conyers de Hulca. And it's interesting, like, I think about it because telling people you've taught for 22 years at a college in New Hampshire does tell them something about your life, right? But telling people something about who your parents were, your lineage, also gives you an image of who they are. And so from my parents, they both did work in archives. So and they did work in foreign languages. So I grew up thinking that true scholarship was in the archives in a foreign language. So I kind of blend that with economics to do commercial history.
Yeah, I feel the same. Well, for me, that's the way I feel because that's sort of what I do. Um, Looking in archives in a foreign language, mainly Spanish, right? Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I think that a lot of people, when we think about these historical topics, you don't think, well, here's somebody who's a professor of management writing about or talking about the history of Spanish and Mexican California or what have you. But you do, and I think that that's well, I like these things where that sort of break our typical ideas that we might have about knowledge and about who's doing what and where you can really learn from. So how did you get, once again, we're just sort of rambling here, but I think it's interesting. How did you get from, well, how did you get to business management? Or maybe how did you get from management to history or history to management? How did that happen?
Well, I'm currently on a mission to flush out Hispanic commercial actors and Hispanic commercial motives in Spanish California. And Spanish California really ends around 1810 because that's when Spain stopped subsidizing California. So I'm really looking for commercial actors who are Hispanic at a very early period, like 1769 to 1810, or even before, like people in the 1750s and 1760s who were talking about we should settle California from Manila. So I noticed that our whole history of not just California, but the Southwest really largely says there were two sets of actors, missionaries and Franciscans, and I mean, missionaries and soldiers. And people who want to go outside the box will then study the Native American communities, which were divided into people who adopted Christianity and people who didn't. But you just never see anybody say there were Hispanic commercial actors. And somebody's bound to say that's not true, that there was Vicente Vasadre, and Adele Ogden wrote about him in 1941. And he was active in California for 3 years in the otter trade, and he didn't make a profit. And she kind of concluded, well, you know, these Hispanic actors just don't have what it takes, and the New Englanders are the brilliant entrepreneurs. And that's kind of silly because there were Hispanic actors in the Pacific Rim sailing every year, pretty much, sometimes more than one ship between Manila and Acapulco, and they always passed California. So I think, 1593 to 1769, there were these Hispanic actors passing through. And then a conventional wisdom is, well, they never got off the ship. Well, that's just not really how it works. When you're sailing, your mast breaks, you run out of water, you tried to trade on the side. And so I think that whole world of Hispanic commercial actors has been missing. And you're right. I'm the only person who studies economics to come into this. And, I grew up with the humanities at the kitchen table, right? Both of my parents were great scholars. So I didn't really need to go get a PhD in history because a lot of the historian's toolbox was something I had learned at the kitchen table. And I wanted to learn something deep and philosophical. And I felt like economics is pretty important to understanding the world. Some people think sex is everything. They go study psychology. I thought the profit motive was pretty important. So I went to go study economics. And economics largely looks at the whole. And I do that too. I look at the Pacific Rim as a whole. So California, I want us to look at that as part of a voyage that starts in Asia, passes California, and goes down to New Spain. And it may go all the way to Lima. You may go to Central America and then Lima. So opposite California is China. Opposite Lima is India. And so I look at that watery route as being the key to understanding commercial actors in California. And I don't think I would have seen that if I didn't teach economics and business every day. And the reason I've gotten more into management over time is because you look inside a business when you're in management. Economists often get reams of data about, GDP or average wage levels or the cost of living. And I did that for a long time, and it's interesting. But at a certain point, you want to get in. I'm more interested in getting inside people's heads and seeing how they took their macro context and made decisions. How am I going to get my family through this? How am I going to make enough money? What are my opportunities? And that's really the business person's mindset. And so I do find management more interesting that way. And I don't just study the past. I also work with business people in Keene to train my students in New Hampshire. But people say, well, you can't study the present and the past at the same time. But I don't actually look at it that way. I think what I'm looking at is how people make decisions about making profits given their institutional context. And that's kind of what I take to both topics.
Well, and we might have talked about this the last time, but when we talk about California in particular and the West Coast, let's say, of the United States, we're always talking about trade with China, trade with Japan, trade with the other side of the Pacific, and how that affects us. Well, it affects the whole country, the relationships with China, trade routes, supply. I mean, for the last 3 years, we've dealt with supply chain issues and what it means when the ports are blocked up or ships can't get in. And if you don't know that context, you may think, well, this is this new world that we're dealing with, or this new economic reality that we're dealing with. And instead, talking to you and reading the things that you write, understand that no, for this has been the reality of trade, of life, at least on the Pacific, for the last 200 to 300 years.
Right. I mean, really 500 years.
Mm.
And yeah, I was at a conference once where somebody got up and talked about the Black Panthers. And I find the Black Panthers fascinating, because I grew up in the 70s in Berkeley. But the Asian American woman who followed her got up and said, well, the Asian impact on California hasn't been nearly as big as the Black Panthers. And that's just actually not true at all. The Asian impact on California has been huge. The crew of the ships in California Spain settled California in 1769, but the crew on the ships with the Manila galleon starting in 1593 were Filipino. And they were often Filipino on the ships afterwards. In fact, in 1779, word got out in Manila that if you joined the San Blas Navy, you would go up to California and collect otter hides. And they were worth a ton of money in Asia. And so a lot of Filipinos were signing up to work for the San Blas Navy because I don't think their wages were very high. I mean, I'm guessing you could probably double your monthly wage with one otter hide if you were a Filipino crew member on one of those ships.
So by the San Blas Navy, you mean the Spanish ships leaving out of the port of San Blas to go and make that route to the Far East and back?
Well, let's talk about that a minute.
Yeah.
The San Blas Navy. And I think we have to start off by making this distinction between England and New England and Spain and New Spain. Because we do often talk about the Spanish. And I think when I grew up in California, I certainly didn't understand the difference between the Spanish and people from Mexico City. Now, I'm not going to call that place Mexico because in the time period we're looking at it, it was New Spain, and the term Mexico meant Mexico City. And I know we all understand pretty well that England and New England got in a war in the 1770s. So we should understand that Spain and New Spain were separate countries that often had disputes, right? But so in 1768, it was actually Spain, the crown, that decided to establish a port on the west coast of New Spain. And they probably did it because the British had just occupied Manila for 2 years. And it had come up that the Spanish crown did not have a single naval base on the American Pacific. A lot of people said, well, they'll take Manila. Next thing you know, the British will be in California. Next thing you'll know, they'll be selling British cottons up and down, because the British held India and India produced cotton. And they'll be selling it to everybody and we'll lose our market. So the San Blas Navy was established by the Spanish crown, and it's established right at the mouth of the Gulf of California. So I know a lot of listeners have been to Los Cabos and, at the tip of Baja California, and the San Blas is basically opposite Los Cabos on the mainland of New Spain. And I like to call this whole region the Greater West. So the Greater West kind of starts with the port of San Blas, and then it goes up Sinaloa and Sonora into southern Arizona and comes across to California and then back down Baja California to Cabo San Lucas. And it's basically a landmass that surrounds the Gulf of California. So the Gulf of California is really, it's this interesting 900-mile long piece of water that's from the Pacific that goes up inland to the Colorado River. And the Greater West is kind of surrounds that body of water. And when I study California history now, I realize that it's very connected. A lot of the people who settled California came from San Blas or Sinaloa or Sonora or Baja California. And They still do, actually. They still do.
Right. I had a question before we go any further. And this is something somebody wrote to me and asked me. And the question is, why, after Vizcaíno comes up the coast of Alta California in 1602, why did the Spanish not go back? Why were they content to not do anything there until they start hearing about the British or the Russians? And my understanding has always been, well, it wasn't top of mind. The only thing that was really interesting on the coast of California at that time, Alta California, was the fact that the Manila galleons could make landfall if they needed to, and then keep going. But do you have any other insight as to why, 170 years pass, 160 some odd years pass before they really decide to do something about that northern territory?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And you're right. I don't think our literature answers it. And there's a very good book that J.M. Mancini wrote in 2018. I think it's called Making, Breaking, and Taking. And she says something which I think I had been thinking, but I hadn't said out loud, which is that the British occupation of Manila, 1762 to 1764, was a watershed moment. If the British wanted Manila, then Manila must be something worth having, which the Spanish crown had thought of Manila as being a fun sink. It took money, didn't make money. And then people said, well, if they take Manila, they'll set up in California. And I think that's been completely left out of the literature. That there was the 7 Years' War was a really big deal. The 7 Years' War, I have always heard that it was the French and Indian War in New England, but actually it was the first global war between the British Empire and the Spanish allied with the French. And it took place in India, in New England, in the Caribbean, and in Europe. And both England and Spain afterwards realized they have to make more money in order to build up for that kind of war, but especially Spain, because it was very humiliating that the British occupied and looted Havana, but it wasn't that long. But they occupied and looted Manila for 2 years, and the East India Company was involved. It wasn't just the British Navy. And it just made people sit up and pay attention to that part of the world. Like you said, they hadn't paid attention to it. Well, now they were willing to hear what everybody in Manila had to say about it. And a lot of people in Manila says, you know, it's crazy not to occupy California. And people in Manila were aware that the Russians in 1741 had moved from Kamchatka, which is if you look at the Pacific Rim and you start in Manila, you go up past Japan. And if you keep going up, you come to the Kuril Islands and Kamchatka, which is part of mainland Russia. And then you keep going and you pass the Bering Strait to come to Alaska. And Alaska is the northernmost point in the Americas, right? And once the Russians were in Kamchatka, they began to explore the piece of the Americas that is very high up there. And really, the Spanish thought that belonged to them. They thought the entire Pacific coast of the Americas from top to bottom belonged to Spain. So people in Manila were early on aware of that. And in 1746, said we should occupy Monterey, build ships in Monterey. And I think that was something that people kept saying. And finally, when the British occupied Manila, the Spanish crown was ready to hear it. But that's actually something I'm going to write about in a different chapter. And today we were supposed to talk about not the Manila, California section, but the California to New Spain section.